Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Sarah Montague. Senator Jeff Flake is one of President Trump's harshest critics. He thinks the president is a danger to America and to the Republican Party. And he's exhorted his fellow Republicans to do something about him. But any Republican who speaks out against President Trump suffers in the polls. It's why Senator Flake won't be standing for election again. He knows he won't win. So why does he think Republicans need to reclaim their party from their own president? Senator Jeff Flake, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thanks for having me on.
Why do you say that President Trump is dangerous?
Well, what I said is he's the type of politics that he practices is a danger to democracy. A type of politics that is crude and crass, and that really doesn't recognize our allies, and expresses a fondness for authoritarians and dictators. That upends arrangements that we have had a hand in creating, this rules-based international order that has made the world prosperous and generally free for 70 years now. That is risked by an American president that behaves the way that he has.
Okay, well, let's take a look at how he's behaved over one particular issue, immigration,
right,
most recently, where we've seen that, in a way, something you've charged, that the checks and balances aren't working, that arguably they are working, that he has listened, that he has softened a policy that is popular with those who voted him in.
Well, certainly, I mean, he came, the first day of his campaign, he talked about this danger from the South. He talked about Mexican rapists. Talked about later a judge that had Mexican heritage who couldn't judge freely or fairly. That was kind of a dog whistle to those, the baser part of our politics. And I think he went too far with this last policy of trying to deter immigration by splitting up families. And gratefully, it was too far.
But what he was doing there in separating children from their parents, and we know over about a 6-week period that there were something like 2,300 children separated, was that he was enforcing a law that already existed. His argument is people were arriving, crossing the border illegally. They could have gone to entry points and claimed asylum. Instead, they tried to do it illegally, and if you enforce the law, that means that you separate a child because you're not going to prosecute the child.
There is no doubt that we need to change the laws. It is inconsistent to have the laws that we have on the books, particularly the Flores settlement, which says that you can't hold children. And because you can't hold children away from their parents, then you can't hold the parents either. Ultimately, you have a policy that the president calls catch and release. You can call it capture and release, catch and release, whatever the case, it doesn't deter, and in fact encourages people to come sometimes with children. So Congress does need to change the laws, but in the meantime, we need to understand that the worst thing you could do is separate families the way that the administration was. Prior administrations, faced with the same dilemma, handled it differently.
But his argument is that they never, in a way, they were encouraging the problem, that there were these loopholes. In the words of the Department from Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen, the voices most loudly criticising the enforcement of our current laws are those whose policies created this crisis and whose policies perpetuate it. Is she right?
Well, there are a lot of things that drive immigration across the border. We're really at fairly low levels historically. It spiked up a bit this year, but it has more to do with economic trends and what's happening in Central and South America.
The Department for Homeland Security says the increase in families entering illegally is 435%.
Well, that's just over a pretty low base over a short period of time. If you look at overall yearly trends, we're down significantly from where we were a couple of years ago. A couple of years ago, we had a spike in unaccompanied minors that came to the border absent their parents. We had to deal with them, and so we had to stand up facilities and whatnot. It never is good But I can't think of anything worse than what we went through in the past couple of weeks.
But President Trump's argument, and he, as we say, he has adapted
Right.
the policy, is that it wasn't working and it wasn't being addressed, and
Right.
that actually he's been calling on legislators to do something about the loopholes. Do you agree with him on that?
Well, I agree that Congress needs to fix it. Where I don't agree, he'll put the blame squarely at the Democrats. I was part of the so-called Gang of Eight. I've been in Congress now for 18 years and have worked on a number of proposals all during that 18 years, all of it on a bipartisan basis. There are Democrats that want to fix this. Not all Democrats. In fact, very few Democrats want open borders. We all want to fix this. It's just been very polarizing and difficult. The president doesn't make it any easier by demonizing just one side. And it makes it more difficult for Republicans to then try to partner with the Democrats, or the Democrats certainly to partner with Republicans.
We're in a situation now where he is saying, and his press secretary is making the point, that his priorities, like funding a border wall, tightening immigration laws, that they should all be fulfilled as part of any legislation. Is that right?
I would like comprehensive reform. I've worked on comprehensive reform. What we passed in 2013, the so-called Gang of Eight bill, was very comprehensive. It provided significant resources for the border, also interior enforcement, guest worker programs, some mechanism to deal with those who are here illegally.
This situation
Right.
where there is almost an encouragement to bring your children because you're going to get in that way.
Well, a lot of that would have been dealt with actually in that legislation. We also dealt with situations in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, the so-called triangle, where we actually appropriated money to help deal with those asylum cases in their own country at U.S. consulates there, so they don't make the trip.
But given where
so a
we
lot
are
of that
now,
has been
given where we are now, and
Right.
Republicans are not agreeing, is it right? Is President Trump right that actually the answer to this for the United States is what he's saying, is to fund the building of a wall?
You know, if you build a wall in terms of asylum cases, which a lot of these are, then they'll simply come to the entry, the points of entry into the border. So the wall is not a Berlin Wall type of wall, gratefully.
Okay,
There
would you
is
vote in
tremendous
favour? Would you
commerce.
vote in favour of putting up the money to build a wall?
Well, it depends on what you mean by a wall. The president's changed his own definition. In some places, we need a more physical structure. In some places, the terrain is such. I'm from Arizona. I've been along that border a lot. Some places you need no barrier at all simply because it's so remote. And so this notion of a 2,500-mile wall is ludicrous. And the president recognizes that, as does the Department of Homeland Security. We do need significantly more resources for the border. I should point out that bill I mentioned, 2013, designated between manpower, personnel, technology, border infrastructure. It was about $41 billion, significantly more than what the president is talking about, but it didn't envision a 2,500-mile structure that the president kind of puts out there and a lot of people envision as something very different from what it is.
Do you think, as a result of this process, and perhaps he always intended it, that he is more likely to get what he wanted?
You know, it depends on, to be able to say, oh, I got a wall. Well, initially he was saying, oh, the Mexicans are going to pay for it. And he still says that. Nobody believes it. But to be able to say, I got a wall, sure, he wants to do that. We do need more infrastructure there, like I said, but far more important is what you do in terms of the drivers of immigration. Part of the reason that we have far less immigration across the border, illegal immigration, than we did perhaps 10 years ago or so, is because of NAFTA, and because we have helped the economy of Mexico. And so fewer Mexicans, we've had net migration south of Mexican citizens. So there are other things that need to be done as well. We're working with these Northern Triangle countries to try to improve their systems of justice and whatnot. And if we can continue to do that, we can relieve some of the pressures.
Right. You have been, as I say, one of President Trump's harshest critics from within his own party. But you've also said, I'm not going to stand for election again.
Right.
If it is so important to you, why not?
There is no place in this party for a Republican like me. It used to be that if you polled in Arizona, for example, say, what are the most important issues to you? Be the economy or jobs, sometimes immigration. Now the most important issue, if you poll those who vote in a Republican primary, is, are you with the president? And that has become the litmus test. Are you with the president? I'm with the president on some things, but I'm not on a number of things. And I could not continue to speak out as I am and win a Republican primary. It's not possible.
So when President Trump heard what you'd done, he tweeted, the reason Flake and Corker,
Right.
Senator Bob Corker, dropped out of the Senate race is very simple. They had zero chance of being elected. Now act so hurt and wounded.
You know, I never had the choice, frankly. I could have never supported this president. Initially, long before he was a candidate, when he espoused this birther theory and pushed it so hard.
That President Obama was not an
That's
American.
right. That was too much for me. And then the comments on Mexican rapists. And then referring to my colleague John McCain as somebody who could not be honored because he had been captured. So it was never in the cards for me to support him. I had hoped that after the election that people would the electorate in Arizona and elsewhere would say, hey, we need people in there who will provide a check on the president. And will vote with him when they think he's right and vote against him when they think he's wrong. Right now, we don't have that in the party. 90% of the Republican Party is right there with the president. This is the president's party right now. I could have, certainly, gone along with that and all of a sudden made myself okay with the president's policies and his behavior. But I couldn't have. There are things more important.
You said it's about his policies and his behavior, but it does sound almost as though it is about decorum. You just don't like the way he does it.
No, it's more than that. Decorum, certainly. I mean, what now has become normal, these tweets, these insults, this degradation of the political culture is awful. And so that's a problem, but it's more than that.
Okay, so when it comes to actually what he's doing, because there were people who heard your speech and thought you were going to stand up against him. Within hours, you're voting on a policy in line with him, which you have done more than 80% of the time.
Well, keep in mind, I'm a conservative. I've believed in that we certainly had to have corporate tax cuts. I would have done the tax bill differently, but we desperately needed to lower the corporate rate. We simply aren't competitive. Voting to repeal Obamacare, I'd voted some 40 times before the president came along.
So you don't object to what he's doing, you just object to the way he's doing it.
There are things, trade policy. We haven't had an opportunity to push back on the president's trade policy. I think it was a huge mistake to exit the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It would be an even worse mistake if we pull out of NAFTA. The president's steel and aluminum tariffs are very detrimental to our economy as well as our relationships with our allies. The president's Muslim ban was patently unconstitutional and unwise. It morphed into something that is probably constitutional but still unwise. The president's policies on picking winners and losers in the economy right now, saying that the Department of Energy ought to buy power from coal plants to keep them alive, regardless of whether they're economically viable or not. Those are not policies I support.
You also said when you were criticising him and saying you wouldn't stand again, the most vexing untruth of all, the supposed hoax at the heart of the Russia investigation.
Right.
Do you think that President Trump is only in power because Russia influenced the election?
No, I don't. I do think the Russians did try to influence the election. They did, intervene at the behest, not at the behest, but certainly to benefit Donald Trump. We don't know if that was dispositive or not, if that affected the elections. I accept that Donald Trump is the president. He was duly elected. We'll never know how much influence that had. But I am troubled that he simply won't let that investigation take its course. It ought to. I have a lot of faith in Bob Mueller, and I hope he's able to finish it.
The investigation is going on. Why?
Yes.
I mean, the president hasn't done anything to stop it.
Right. Well, he's just tried to undermine it. So I hope he lets it take its course. But he hasn't fired Bob Mueller or Rosenstein or
Indeed.
Session. I hope he continues that posture. But it's not healthy. It's not right to denigrate and undermine institutions like the FBI, Department of Justice, and the free press. The president, and this is what real problem I have as well, is calling fake news real and real news fake, and referring to the press as the enemy of the people. He should know that that phrase does not have a noble pedigree. And those things are dangerous, particularly when you have journalists around the world being detained and in some cases killed, certainly detained in record numbers, in some cases on fake or false news charges that kind of echo the language that he uses. And so that's very detrimental.
But when you accused him, when you picked up accusing him of using Stalinist language, the Republican National Committee chairwoman, Ronna McDonald, tweeted, "You've gone too far. Comparing the leader of the free world to murderous dictators is absurd."
Well, certainly you don't compare him to Stalin. I should say that somebody like the President of the United States should know better than to use a phrase that somebody like Stalin made famous. That's what I was pointing out there.
You criticize the president, and yet you're talking about a man who is overseeing an incredibly strong economy where unemployment is at its lowest in 18 years, 3.8%. GDP revisions keep going up. It's growing strongly. Whilst there are people in the United States who are strongly opposed to him, amongst the Republican base, he gets ratings of 85% or even more. The argument is that he is doing the right thing and you shouldn't even be there. Well, you've lost.
Keep in mind, these things that I think have been the main drivers of a better economy have been being pushed by the Congress for a long time. In particular, regulatory reform. We use something called the Congressional Review Act to throw out a lot of regulations that had been enacted by the last administration. The president has done some good things on regulation. I've been pleased to support him. We were overburdened on the regulatory state, and that's been a good thing for the economy, even better than the tax cuts. The tax cuts were important as well, particularly on the corporate side. So that has laid the groundwork for a good economy. I'm afraid, though, in the long term, that trade wars will nix it all. I mean, we don't win trade wars. And try as we might, we haven't been able to move the president on that notion that, that there are, that trade is somehow a zero-sum game. If somebody's doing well, somebody must be losing.
And President Trump has imposed tariffs on steel and aluminium.
Right.
And there are retaliatory tariffs, at least from the EU, being put in place. Do you see it as inevitable that there will be a trade war?
Yes, yes. I don't know how you can impose tariffs and stick to them like that. Or what's even worse is to impose...
How will it play out, though? Because it's all very well. People say, look, ultimately, he's saying this is a bad deal for America. He's in it to get a better deal for Americans.
Right. NAFTA, there were parts of NAFTA that needed to be changed. A lot of those were going to be revised in the Trans-Pacific Partnership deal because we have the same member countries. But what we say, those of us who believe in free trade, is that we have a rules-based international order that we were the main architect of. That if we have issues with China, and we have many issues with China and some of our trade partners, even some of our allies, then you use that structure that you've set up, not simply go around it and impose tariffs. And what happens is there is retaliation. Certainly there's going to be, or already has been, from the European Union, Canada, and Mexico. And the response is then to ratchet up yet again. Nobody wins trade wars.
But you recognize even that you've lost the argument, don't you?
For a time, for a time. I do think that we will get through this. We have to. Populism is called populism for a reason. It's popular. You can win elections now and then, but you can't govern with it. Anger and resentment is not a governing philosophy, and it only goes so far. And there are pendulum swings in politics, certainly in American politics. And so I do think this is President Trump's party right now. It is, no doubt. you cannot win a Republican primary around the country if you're highly critical of the president's behavior or his politics. But that won't always be the case.
How long?
I don't know. You know, it could be. Elections
because you have said, and you wrote a book, Conscience of a Conservative, and you said these are the spasms of a dying party.
Yes.
Is the Republican Party dying under President
if we
Trump?
continue on this course, yes. If you just simply look at demographics, right now, women, suburban women, and young people they've been walking away from the party for a while. They're in a dead sprint right now. When you look out there, Republicans did the right thing after Mitt Romney's loss, when we said, all right, let's do this autopsy. Let's see where we are. And the conclusion was, we've got to appeal to a broader base. Now, and then a couple months later, we chased a populist. You can win an election here or there, but overall, there simply aren't enough.
What is the answer? Because you are not alone. I mean, there are likes of Steve Schmidt, who's a longtime Republican strategist and was advising George W. Bush, John McCain. He's renounced his membership of the party because he says it's fully the party of Trump. He goes on, it's corrupt, indecent, immoral. Our politics are badly broken. What is the answer then for somebody like you? Is to stand for another party?
No, I think we work best. Our history has proven that two strong parties produces pretty good government. Usually divided government is best. If you look at, if you believe in fiscal conservatism, for example, limited government, economic freedom, you would at least need divided government periodically. So I hope the Republican Party can come back.
So you're not walking away from the party?
No.
You're not renouncing your membership?
No, I'm not.
You will stay in the party and do what? Would you
I
stand
hope to
against
bring
him
it back.
as president?
I've said that I hope that somebody does run, another Republican, in the Republican primary. I haven't ruled it out, but I'd rather not. I've been in politics now 18 years in the Congress, and it'd be nice to wait till this fever breaks to get back in. But I do hope that somebody goes out, and I did go give a speech in New Hampshire, because I think Republicans are dying to know that there are real Republicans and conservatives out there who aren't.
Stand. Because so you will stand at some point to run for president.
I'm not saying that, but
you're not saying that. Though. That's what's so interesting.
I'm not. Well, I do hope that somebody goes out to remind Republicans what Republicans stand for and what conservatives stand for, and that offer an optimistic vision of where we should go.
You talk about the situation being a recipe for disaster. You use the word danger. The pendulum needs to swing back. How dangerous or how disastrous could things get before the pendulum swings back?
Well, if you spark a full-scale trade war, then that affects the global economy. I mean, it's not just our economy, it's the world economy that is affected. If you continue to express fondness for authoritarianism, then you give license to governments that shouldn't have that license or that credibility. So it does have an effect. These things on the trade issues, it has more than just an economic effect as well. Pulling out of the TPP was disastrous because those countries, those countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, would like to be part of our trade orbit, but they will be sucked into China's vortex. And if for somebody who expresses, and I think rightly so, this opinion that it's China, they're our competitor. We've certainly done everything that we shouldn't have done if we were to address that situation, because we've made it far easier for China to fill the trade vacuum. And that has implications not just with the economy, but with geopolitics as well.
Senator Jeff Flake, thank you for coming on Hard Talk.
Thank you. Appreciate it.